We'll get to the stars here in a second. I'll just say I'm going to add author wrangler to my CV pretty soon. So I'm excited to have that, or some variation of that. But I'm glad to be in Malaprop. Feel a little bit like that Night at the Museum movie, where they kind of like unleash the kids in the place that's sort of heaven for them. So for me, the son of a librarian, my first job was in a bookstore. So being in the bookstore after it's closed with just 5 other people is a little bit like being a geeky kid in a candy store. So excited to be here, and super excited to be here to talk about this book and to ask questions of 2 folks who I've talked to before, but never actually met in person. So really glad to be here. And I'll just say, the book is really extraordinary. So when I think about what I want from narrative nonfiction, I want somebody who's going to tell me a story, and I want somebody who's going to make me believe something about the people and about the place. But I also want people in a story that's going to tell me something broader about North Carolina politics or American politics, or better yet, the way that people interact and the way that people act given certain constraints. And this is a great story. It is one of the few books that might say politics or political science at the bottom on the back that I can say I laughed out loud multiple times. It is the kind of book that's sort of made in some ways, I think, to be a movie. Really, when you think about the characters, the character development of the book, it's pretty amazing. It's the kind of book, it's not your 5-chapter academic wonk fest. It is a lot of short, tight chapters filled with smart dialogue about smart people. And I think it taught me a lot about this one case, but also about politics in general. So I really encourage you to read it and to buy it. Thinking about kind of North Carolina politics books in general. If you've read Wilmington's Lie, I think it reminds me of much of the same things that made Wilmington's Lie really hit home with me, right? It's a story about a place and a time and certain people, but it tells us something bigger. I think some about Brian Simon's book on the Hamlet fire, which he had a book reading in this very spot right before the pandemic, if I remember right. I think I was sitting in the audience, but very, very similar, and it tells a really tight story, but his book makes a bigger point about labor and about economics. I think this book does much of the same thing. So I really do encourage it in the strongest sense. And so my hope tonight is that we can have a conversation, but we'll have a conversation led by these 2 smart folks. And so I'll just kind of begin by asking them, and I'm sort of assuming that y'all know the basics of the story. I'm sure they'll get into it, right? But this is, I think everybody would say, the most well-documented case of election fraud, not voter fraud, but election fraud, perhaps in United States history. And it took place in Bladen County. And so I'll begin with the place. What is it about Bladen County that led to this story? And if it's all right, maybe I'll start with Nick, because his role growing up near there is so central to the book.
So if I can start actually by answering your question with something that seems contradictory, or you wouldn't expect. I didn't want to cover this story. Actually, I didn't think there would be a story. And it's in part because I grew up in Hope Mills, North Carolina, 30 minutes away from Bladen County. I like to joke the closest point of civilization you can get to being in Bladen County. But to be quite frank, growing up in that part of the world, you heard about election shenanigans and tomfoolery, none of which was ever really proven. It was just every election. You heard something. So that was my background as a kid. And then, we saw in 2016, Pat McCrory and his bid for governor, or bid for re-election rather, went to McCray, this guy named McCray Dallas, or Leslie Dallas. No one knew who that was at that time. And that didn't pan out. And so here we were in 2018, even after the Board of Elections said, we're going to look at this a little bit. It was my natural instinct to say, this isn't going to be a story. It wasn't a story last time. It wasn't a story when I was a kid. And I've got a lot of other things going on right now. And when I ultimately stopped what I was doing and drove to Bladen County, I was in Raleigh. My mom lives in Raleigh, so I have a Raleigh bureau. I like to joke that somewhere I can go stay with mom and do reporting. So I was in Raleigh fronting another big investigation I had, hard-hitting investigation I've been working on for a long time. And I mean, it was really, no one watched it or read it, but it was really good. You guys should go back and read it. And it aired, and it made zero waves anywhere, because that same day, my friend Joe Bruno, who works at WSOC in Charlotte, had gotten an interview with a woman who said she'd done some things for McRae Dallas, and everyone suddenly was fixated on Bladen County. And so I said, crap, I guess I'm going to have to go to Bladen County. So the next morning, and we can talk about this more, but I woke up and drove to Bladen County, and the rest, as they say, is history.
I came at it a little differently. I was a freelance writer at the time. So the one thing, as a freelance writer is when somebody pays you to go somewhere, you go there. And so that was how I wound up in Bladen County. Politico called me. They said, we don't know what this story is going to be, but can you just go there and spend a few days? And I'm glad you started with the place. I mean, place is so important to every story that I think I tell. Even sitting here right now, because Malaprop's has been a part of my life for 20 years now. I've come to Asheville and come to Malaprop's, and sitting here now, it's just like, wow, I just feel connected to Asheville. And I'm going to buy some books for my son. But place is so important. So I didn't grow up in Fayetteville. I didn't grow up in Bladen County, but I worked in Fayetteville as a newspaper reporter for 4 years during the heart of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And as Nick would like to point out, it was while he was in high school in Fayetteville. But I was a newspaper reporter there at the same time. And it's just such a distinct place. I can say it is that area is a part of who I am now, because I spent my 20s there. And you don't forget where you are in your 20s, I don't think. And so when I was going back there and just hearing people talk and hearing the accents and feel, seeing the sand beneath, you walk out there and you kick the sand up underneath your feet in the grass because the sand goes there, and you're just like, wow, this fraud scandal, this whole controversy, I think, is born out of the soil. It's not just like one or two guys. Like, it has to be something deeper there. And so, I wrote a story for Politico that was about the place, and I just kept thinking about the place. And 2 weeks later, I wrote a story. A friend of a friend said, you should probably look into the role race played in this. And I thought, well, yeah, we should. So I wrote an essay for Charlotte Magazine on the role race played in politics in Eastern North Carolina from Reconstruction to today. And so this just sort of was born out of both of those stories for me. And then we ran into Nick, and I ran into Nick down there. Nick and I have been friends for 3 years, and we saw each other on the front lawn of the Elizabethtown.
The day I drove to Bladen County for the first time was the day Mike was down there working for Politico, and at the end of the day, I think I was getting ready to do some live shots, and Mike was, I don't actually know what you were doing, but he was parked near the courthouse.
Looking for stuff.
And funny seeing you. We chatted for a while, and we did not know then. Here we would be 3 years later talking about it still, because we wrote a book about it. So
yeah, I like to wander places unnoticed. Nick had a TV camera on there. So we Nick and I came at the story from different perspectives. It's amazing to think that we're sitting here right now.
Yeah, it's great. Yes, Mike goes places unnoticed. Nick tries to never go places unnoticed, and so it works out, and it's really nice. What comes out in the end. We were talking before, so in a very Asheville way, we went and had a beer before we got here. And so one thing we were talking about was today happens to be the day of the Wilmington massacre. And it was interesting when I first started reading the book, I didn't expect to make that connection, right? I didn't expect to be reading a book about modern day election fraud and about McRae Dallas, about Bladen County today, and have a story from that long ago kind of be weaved in. So I don't know, maybe do you guys want to give folks that are watching a little bit of a sense about how those two stories actually touch each other in ways we wouldn't expect?
Well, at the center of the modern day story, well, obviously was not only this political operative, Republican political operative named McRae Dallas, but was also this organization, the Bladen Improvement Association, which is a Black political action committee formed essentially to help, as with the same with the communities in Durham and Charlotte, to make sure that that Black people have representation in political bodies. And so at the center, we had these multiple news stories, some of which Nick was reporting out at the time, of these two kind of groups going head to head and accusing each other of fraud. And I thought, that's got to go back a lot farther than this. Like, this couldn't have started yesterday. And so I knew, through years of working in that area, I just knew that there was a history of election, sort of back and forth between races and elections there. And it goes all the way back to Reconstruction. And so I went back and started to look at certain pieces of history there and found, learned or pieced it together that George Henry White, who was the last Black congressman before Jim Crow laws effectively eliminated Black representation in Congress from 1901 to like 1928. George White was the last Black congressman to stand on the floor of the House, and he's from Bladen County. He was born and raised there. In fact, his family is one of the most prestigious. He's from one of the most prestigious families, Black families in North Carolina, Spaldings. So I got on the phone. The Spaldings have a family historian. The Spaldings, for those who don't know, C.C. Spalding and his ancestors helped start Black Wall Street in Durham. And I thought, wow, like this prestigious family, they had ties. Their uncle was George Henry White, and he's from Bladen County. And election laws effectively made it sure that he wasn't going to be able to serve anymore. I mean, you're talking about grandfather clause, literacy tests, all these things. And so when George Henry White left North Carolina, he famously said, "May goddamn North Carolina the place of my birth." And he moved to New Jersey and started his own town there with his family. And I thought, wait, so you're talking about, we've all read the stories of the Great Migration, but this is a smaller scale migration that happened after Wilmington in 1898, where Wilmington was one of the wealthiest, most prosperous cities for Black people in America. And today, I still think it could be the Atlanta of the South, probably, had this event not happened 123 years ago today, because a lot of the wealth, a lot of the business leaders, a lot of the political leaders left. They went to New Jersey, they went to Washington, they went to Durham, places that were friendlier and would allow more opportunity for them to succeed. And so you just thought, wait, if Wilmington, to me, if Wilmington was Atlanta, then what would Bladen County be? It's the bedroom community of Wilmington. But instead, what we have in Bladen County today is something completely different. It's a county that's losing population. It's a county where a kid grows up there, if she wants to go to college, she doesn't return to Bladen County. So, you start to think like, wow. And I have a relationship with friends with Hugh McCall, Bank of America, former Bank of America CEO in Charlotte. He always says, he's got this line that says, racism is really expensive and it costs people money. And it costs Wilmington this incredible opportunity to be the grand city of the South. And so that event, the ripples from Wilmington 1898, obviously are here today, but on an economic scale too. Mm-hmm. And so I just thought, okay, well, George Henry White was from there. There have to be direct ties. And sure enough, we found 2 generations removed. We were able to connect what happened in Wilmington in 1898, essentially, to the election process.
It's incredible, right? Like, I would never have expected that linkage to work, right? And so, were you surprised to kind of see that? How did that unfold for you?
Yeah, well, and so in full disclosure, Mike did all the work on part 2, which is the history section. He did a fantastic job. I would have tried a poorer version of that and written a poorer version of that had I not been writing this with him. But it is one of the things that struck me the most when I got on the ground to do this reporting in Bladen County is how palpable the racial tension is on the ground in Bladen County. And people just talk about white people and black people talk about everything in racial terms still. And it's just how it is. And so to understand what happened in the 2018 election and what has happened in Bladen County and what is happening in Bladen County in real time, you have to understand that tension between races. And that just didn't happen. It didn't pop up overnight. It didn't start in 2017 or because of any particular candidate. That's how it has been. And so actually the thing I'm most proud of about the book is that we do draw that straight line basically from Reconstruction through Wilmington all the way up through 2018. And you can see how the political tensions and the racial tensions intertwine and force people on all sides to do things that may not be the best for democracy in the long run.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a lot of sort of unexpected things in the book too. I'll say, like, you know, everybody from Zion Williamson to Ken Griffey Jr. to, I mean, like, you're surprised. I was surprised. Maybe you'll see these things better than me. I was surprised every page at sort of who I would find and how these stories would intermingle. And the fact that it's such a modern story but has such big historical roots, I think, tells us a lot about how human patterns are more ingrained than we tend to think they are, right? That we tend to think that, okay, this is a one-off event. I think there are very few one-off events, I guess.
Things don't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
Nothing happens in a vacuum. That's how I approach my work as an investigative reporter every day, whether it's a calamity or election fraud or anything in between. There's a societal force that led to whatever happened. And so it was really important to me, and I think to Mike as well, that we uncover and peel back the layers. How did we get to this point? And I think a real unfortunate thing about what most of the country knows about what happened in Bladen County in 2018 is that it's tied to one flash candidate in one point in time. And that misses all of the deeper context, and it misses all of the deeper understanding of how we got to what happened. You know, what happened in 2018 was this perfect collision of a lot of forces that just exploded into a congressional election being vacated, which is crazy. That is an extreme event, and it took a lot to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about it before. I said, you know, you have a hot tub and you have one person swimming in it, but you have to look at the hot tub. Like, you have to, like, you have to, like, think about the water and what caused this, rather than just focus on the one or two people that have made national headlines. To be frank, and if you really wanted to write the short version of the story, I work for Axios, the smart brevity version of the story, you'd say that, you know, this 2018 happened because of the 2010 sheriff's race, where a black sheriff got elected for the first time in Bladen County, and white people in Bladen County got scared that they were losing their power, and so they created an organization that could, quote, get out the vote and desperately wanted to win back that power. And so we always say this, we always joke, none of the things that led to the election fraud scandal in Bladen County had anything to do. In fact, Dan McCready called me after we had finished the book, and he was like poking around. It's like, I think he was like wondering why we didn't call him for a deeper interview for the book. And it's about the pool. It's not about you. It's not about you and Mark Harris. It's about the systems in place that create this issue.
Oh, that's great. That's such a good way to look at it. So maybe that's a good time to, I'm only going to pull out one quote from the book, I promise. But one that I think maybe I'd like to hear what these guys have to say about kind of some of the broader implications. And it's early on in the book, but they say we shouldn't dismiss the election fraud that happened here as an outlier, but recognize it as an early stage disease. Right? So it's kind of curious, especially in today's context when we have conversations more often than we like, frankly, about election integrity, about voter fraud or election fraud, or how these things come together. What were we all thinking when you wrote that, and kind of how do you think about that sentence and what this the early stage disease is of?
Well, I think Nick and I have similar but different answers to this. We are in a situation now where political campaigns are getting wealthier and wealthier. And I think we did the numbers, and I wish that I'd written them down, but the McCready-Harris race, they raised what, $10 million or something like that between the two of them. The median household income in Bladen County is like $32,000. Like, you could fund how many jobs with this amount of money these political campaigns are bringing. So you start to wonder, like, if impoverished areas are becoming more impoverished and political campaigns are getting more rich, the opportunity to take advantage of these situations, the opportunity for political campaigns to be the best and biggest employer in these counties is there. And so how, maybe not the best employer, I'm sorry, the biggest employer, the biggest opportunity. And so what we had in this situation was a lot of folks who ran some of these get up the vote efforts were taking $100 and $120 checks at a time, or cash at a time, because it was good money. And it was, but to a Mark Harris campaign or to a Dan McCready campaign, that's no money. You know, $100 here, $100 there is nothing. So we just, that's kind of what I meant about that. If that distance between how folks are actually living and how political campaigns are run and how rich they are doesn't somehow come together, we're just going to see more opportunity for stuff like this. We can write all the rules in the world, we can make all the laws in the world, and you know what we also get to is that the disease is trust. The disease is that folks just don't trust things. Even if you have all the evidence presented to you, you don't trust it. And that's what we found time and again in this book, is that, you know, Nick and I talk, like, we sometimes joked that everybody in Bladen County was lying to us. But at the same time, I think a lot of them believed their lies. And that is the strange, that was the dynamic that we were coming back to time and again. It's just, wow, like, you just lied to me. You didn't even know it. And that's the scary thing. It's like, and that
It did it so believable,
right? And that's what leads, you know, disease obviously ends up with things happening that would happen in the Capitol on January 6th. But you know, folks believe something that wasn't true, and that's what I mean. So this has been happening in Bladen County for decades. Like, that's what leads to January 6th. So when we talk about the disease, we wrote that line before January 6th. So I mean, that's yeah.
With the erosion of trust comes additional polarization, more divisiveness, right? You see people leaning in more to personalities or to their factions, right? I mean, that's really what we saw in Bladen County. Wasn't any ideological fight. It was really factions of people fighting against each other to just win for their group. And so I think we saw it play out. I mean, this is what happens when people, like Mike said just a couple minutes ago, the 2018 election fraud had very little to do with Mark Harris and Dan McCready, other than that happened to be the two names on the ballot, right? The folks on the ground in Bladen County were fighting with one another. The Bladen Improvement PAC was fighting with McCrae Dallas's group and vice versa over local elections, over the chance to get their congressional candidate in office, over the sheriff's race that was back on the ballot again that year. That's what the fight was about, though, between the factions. And if we don't do something in this country to tamp down the divisive partisanship that looks beyond ideology, that's pure just distrust of one another, of our neighbors, this is what can happen on a much broader scale.
So what are the implications then for thinking about policy making going forward, right? I mean, both parties, I think, have weaponized this case. I think it's probably fair to say, right? I mean, you certainly see sometimes Republican parties saying, look, this is an example of election fraud, right? And therefore we need stronger security measures. And then you've seen Democrats weaponize the very same event and say, it's not us you should be worried about, it's them. Does this story have any implications for how we should think about election integrity in North Carolina?
I'm going to butcher something that Zoe Chase said at This American Life. She did a podcast called The Improvement Association about Bladen County, and she opened the whole series. I'm going to mangle this by saying something to the effect of Republicans like talking about this case because it's a case of actual election fraud. Democrats like talking about the case because it's a case of Republicans perpetrating election fraud. And then she has a third one. She likes talking about it because, it's much more complicated than that. And that's true, right? And again, the fact, I hope people will actually read the book, buy all the copies, but please read one of them, maybe. But, I think if you read the book, the takeaway should be that this is not a problem that is unique or exclusive to one party, at least not in Bladen County. And the thought that I think most of the public has about Bladen County being one dude who was working for one candidate who did one thing, one time, is demonstrably not true. And to the extent that the way we're going to tidy up and finish the 2018 election scandal is by, saying, well, we stopped that one dude, one group, it's over. That is going to be disastrous unless we address the broader root of the problem.
I think anytime you create distrust like that, just open a space for a willing participant, criminal. I don't know, open the space for a willing person to take advantage of whoever it is. And so when you have this space of distrust, and there are willing people who are willing to exacerbate, people who are willing to take advantage of it, people who are willing to, I guess, go to political rallies and tell people that there's that to just widen that gap, you can take advantage of distrust. So I mean that, what does it have? Wider implications for North Carolina? I think certainly. I mean, I just think that we don't. I didn't want people to leave the book feeling like there's no hope for things, but I do. And what we hope is that people read the book and say, like, we're not focusing on the right things. You can't look for one person to be the fall guy for everything that's happened. Like, Craig has his flaws. Mark Harris has his flaws. Everybody has their flaws in this, but you can't just say, like, it's too simple to say one person is the problem.
Right.
It's too simple.
And the lack of trust comes up like a lot during the book. So in terms of lack of trust to some degree in the electoral system, but I would argue more about politicians in general, more about government, about the criminal justice system. It comes up frequently, sort of a general sense of distrust. And although Bladen County is, 6 hours away from where we are today, I think you kind of feel some similar stories in the mountains, right? I mean, even on the vote fraud, vote buying, I think about Madison County, and I think about some of these, sort of sheriff races that happened in Madison County for a long time that folks know about around here. So, I mean, you do see some similarities, and I think the lack of trust that is a thread that runs throughout much of the state, even if the shape of it and the elevation of it may change. I mean, are there things that we can do? I mean, so the problem, if the problem is not McCray Dell, it's not that he was helping, but if he's not the core thing we need to solve, and I completely agree with him, then what is it? How do we build back trust in institutions even slowly?
So I think it starts by looking at, let's go back to talking about place, right? And whether it's rural Eastern North Carolina or rural Western North Carolina, there are a lot of similarities there, right? And we're talking, and let's go back to economic inequality, right? When you have broken down and you are in a community that doesn't have a functioning press, right? Doesn't have functioning institutions that serve as a check on how government functions, doesn't impose societal norms or any accountability, right? And that's all exacerbated by the fact that the people who do live there are, for better or for worse, are for all intents and purposes marginalized economically, and they have very little power to stand up and challenge these things. When you have the continued breakdown of institutions in society, which we've seen, I think, both ends of the state, taking out the 4085 corridor, right? I think that it is the perfect breeding ground for this kind of thing, for people to come in and be taken advantage of by politicians and campaigns and political operatives and people that are looking to use folks to advance their agendas and their candidacies and their interests. It's perfect breeding ground for that.
Wasn't hopeful.
Sorry.
I don't think that was as hopeful as Chris was looking for.
Well, I'm about hope.
Well, what is the hope? I look at my son, who's 20 months old, and think I really want this world to be a better place for him. And so when I was writing the book, I'm trying to show science that there are better places. There are really good people working in elections, really good people working in politics too. We mentioned it as a source very extensively in the book, but Josh Lawson, who worked for the elections board at the time, just the efforts he went to try to make sure everybody knew that this was happening, to try to get people to listen to him, were just tremendous. I think we need to elect more honest people, and I think we need a system that helps us elect more honest people. And it sounds like so elementary to say that, but I think it's the key to everything. We need to elect people who are not willing. I mean, throughout the book, we found that politicians, statewide politicians in North Carolina, were working in their own best interests the entire time. From
that is exclusive of no party. That is everybody.
But,
yeah.
And just so, okay, we have to elect folks that truly work for the people. And it doesn't matter which party it is. You have to elect folks that are honest. If folks are lying, they need to go. I mean, if they're perpetrating lies, they need to go. It doesn't matter.
Are we good on time? You walked up, I thought, oh, maybe.
Oh, it was, it was more about the.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we're good. Okay, great.
Yeah, we're good. We've got about 8 to 10 more minutes.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great. So I got all sorts of things I want to get into. Some are completely selfish questions, but I'll try to go with a slightly more selfless one.
We're calling this a lightning round.
It's exactly what it is. Go. What do you know? That's a pretty good idea. I should have prepped a lightning round. But I said I was only going to do one quote, and here I lied. So I'm gonna run counter to what we're just talking about here. But at some point you talk about a federal. So this has been going on a long time, right? So the federal prosecutor was too busy chasing voter fraud that was non-existent to pay attention to the election fraud, and now quote, the election fraud that was really happening. And so as we're thinking about ways to, sort of institutional causes and potential institutional solutions, maybe can you talk a little bit about that? How did the look over here when we should have been looking over there work? And how can we maybe work towards some sort of a solution in the future?
We need our institutions to work. When I just talked about we need our institutions to work, that you just gave the example of we need the U.S. attorney when he's presented with a 300-page brief of election fraud in Bladen County to actually read the thing and maybe prosecute some things, right? I mean, Mike just talked about Josh Lawson, who banged his head against the wall and against every other hard surface, trying to get somebody to actually investigate the voter fraud that everyone knew was happening. It was well documented in Bladen County. There's one of the craziest things we talk about in the entire book to me was something that my colleague David Hodges at WBTV dug up in Bladen County. We were on the ground reporting right after the election. David found a voter who called the Board of Elections in the 2014 election, I think, the 2016 election, who called the Board of Elections to file a complaint because the Improvement Association didn't come to pick up his ballot. He called to complain that the person didn't come to harvest their ballot. I mean, that's what he called to do, because they were disabled and every year someone came to get his ballot. And no one ever looked at that. That is a failure of the system. And we document really well. The U.S. Attorney didn't look at it. The district attorney who was in charge of Bladen County, John David, may or may not have actually wanted to look at it, but he was in, at the time, a secret affair with a county commissioner in Bladen County, who they're now maybe engaged or living together, but at the time she was married to somebody else, and he tried to get involved in the investigation, but the Board of Elections knew he was having this affair. The county commissioner had been a client of McCrae Dallas's, and so the Board of Elections was keeping him at bay, so he couldn't be involved, and so that's how eventually Lauren Freeman got it, the DA in Wake County in Raleigh. But how can voters trust that things are going to be on the up and up if your institutions aren't working like they should? And that involves both going after the root cause of problems as well as actually being open to listening to them in the first place. And Bladen County in 2018, when I talk about it being this big explosion of things and collision of things, chief among them is that everyone's hearing this problem and seeing this problem, has evidence of this problem, and they refuse to do anything about it. And I don't know that what's been done about it to date is enough to actually address the problem.
What was the attorney doing at that time? What were they investigating?
Oh, instead they were investigating immigrants. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of North Carolina was investigating immigrants for voter fraud. And we ticked through a list of examples of people who got arrested for federal voter fraud that, what do we talk about? An Italian immigrant who lives here for 30 years, who cast a vote. Some people who maybe pleaded guilty, if they did, to misdemeanors and got. So this is what the U.S. Attorney decided to spend his time and attention on, instead of the people who were, committing actual voter fraud in Bladen County.
Yeah, that's one of the greatest failures of this whole thing, was that the packet of information was on the desk, but directed by whoever. He was investigating these individual claims rather than this larger scheme that they knew was happening. And that's just like, so, and then there's like 11 or 12 people total. They had spent a year going after it. And like, I think only a handful of them actually turned out to be any case of actual fraud. You went after individuals, 11, built cases against them when you knew that there was organizational fraud.
Or did they know? Maybe they didn't know because they didn't choose to read the actual brief.
Right.
Election fraud in Bladen County was not a secret to anybody. Right. It hadn't been a secret for at least a decade. Right. And yet no one did anything about it.
Well, that's what's one of the things interesting, right? I mean, just looking at the data, it's not confusing what's happening here. McCrae Dallas did not hide it very well. This was not a
because it wasn't bad.
Right.
What McCrae Dallas was doing to the people of Bladen County wasn't bad, because he wasn't the only person doing it. Look, I'll tell you, the first thing I said to McCrae Dallas and we can talk about how I ended up in his driveway. Yeah. But when I ended up in his driveway the first day, I shook his hand and I said, I don't know what you have done or haven't done, but I know you're not the only person doing it. That has proven to be true, even though that's not been the larger narrative. But it certainly comes out in the book. And so in Bladen County, what McCrae Dallas was doing, legally or illegally, is no different than what other people were doing to win elections. Not just the Improvement PAC, but other people with political interests in Bladen County. And it had been going on for a long time, and no one had been doing anything about it, even though people had gone down to look at it. And every time they had the opportunity to do something about it, they said, this is fine. And we kept up.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, maybe I mean, there's so many good stories in the book, and I hope that's getting clear in the conversation. I mean, do you guys have a favorite sort of story or anecdote from the book? Maybe it's about how you first got there. Maybe it's about there really is a lot. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, we've been talking. We've had a very serious discussion here about elections and election fraud. But throughout the book, there's all this wild scenes of America just unfolding before our eyes. And a lot of it happened because Nick had access to this world, and he would call me. So there were, I mean, so many examples. But I do know there was one example. Nick called me and he said, McCrae Dallas just left this court hearing, and there are hundreds of TV cameras there, or hundreds of reporters, dozens of reporters there, and McCrae called Nick from the Chick-fil-A parking lot. He was sipping sweet tea, and you're like, and I said, Nick, just write down everything right now, and email it to me. Like, what did he say? What on earth could he be calling you about? Like, and it's just like, why is he at Chick-fil-A just enjoying like sweet tea and a cigarette? And
What else would you do after 2 days in prison?
Always the cigarettes, right?
so there were countless examples like that where Nick would call me and say, McCrae just called me and you wouldn't believe what happened. And it's like, all right, let's knock it down. Let's get it down. We've said it over here. I never interviewed McCrae for this book without a reporter. It was our way to like balance Nick's management of the relationship with McCrae. Nick has a relationship that's different, but I was always just a reporter, person we were interviewing. McCrae never really trusted me. I don't know if McCrae liked me. I don't know, but we had all this access to him, and just time and again he would tell me. And we showed up this time in 2019. We showed up to his house, and he had his Christmas tree up. I said, "Great, it's like November 10th." I said, "Well, in these parts, we like Santa Claus to come early." It was just like this, and it's like sort of laughable as it is, like it embodied the spirit of the area. This hope that, gosh, maybe I could just hit the lottery, maybe Santa could come, maybe I could win this election. Whatever it is going to take me out of this situation. And McCrae has been living with that for 3 years. He's just been hoping to get out of this situation and hoping that Santa Claus would come.
Wow. You have a favorite?
No, I've been thinking, I have so many. The book's full of crazy things. We've been having this very serious discussion, but it's full of nutty things, which is why I, a TV reporter, was like, crap, I need to figure out how to write a book. And I wrote a book because the stuff I'm living through is just unbelievable. Actually, I'll just tie it back into what Mike, the whole story about how I came to meet McCrae is interesting. It's in the book. You should read it. But the whole story about McCrae going to jail and getting arrested is equally crazy. You should also read that. But I will say, McCrae was arrested 45 minutes after he and I got off the phone. For about a year, McCrae called me every day or multiple times a day. We still talk about once a week or so. And McCrae called me. It was like 10:30, 10:45 in the morning. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm just at Terry's." He's got a friend named Terry Dove who owns a barbecue restaurant in Bladenboro. He said, "I'm just at Terry's drinking tea, having a sweet tea." He said it just like that. And I like bourbon. I said, "If I were you, I'd need a little bit stronger brown liquid in that cup." This was right after the hearing where Mark Harris called for a new election, as we now know, minutes before he was arrested for indicted on his first indictment. And he laughed and he just sounded laid back. I think he said, probably said something to the effect of, "I'm just trying to take a breath and be chill with a man who's got all these eyes on him." And so we had this conversation, and he was laid back, I was laid back, and 45 minutes later, I get a call on the phone from somebody that I didn't answer, who was calling to tell me that McCrae had just been arrested by the State Bureau of Investigation. And so I say that to say, literally, McCrae being arrested and going to jail was bookended by McCray and I talking about sweet tea. Before pre-arrest from Terry Doe's barbecue restaurant, post-arrest from Chick-fil-A, where he said, meet me. He called after he got out of jail and said, meet me around the corner here at this Chick-fil-A. And he wanted to go to the Chick-fil-A. He wanted to smoke a cigarette. He wanted sweet tea. And they don't have a Chick-fil-A. So why not?
It was not on a Sunday, evidently.
It was not on a Sunday.
But it's funny because Nick, we also got the discovery files for the case, just hundreds and hundreds of pages of what investigators were doing at certain times. So when putting together that scene in the book, Nick talks to McCray 45 minutes before he gets arrested. McCray gets arrested 45 minutes later. We also saw what the authorities were doing at that time, and it was almost, it was like they were like stopping at parties to look for it. And
It's
like,
a
all
minute
like,
by minute breakdown of this intense police procedural playing out in Bladenboro, North Carolina. They have a team meeting, and agent so-and-so and agent so-and-so go to the Hardys, and agent so-and-so and so-and-so, set up shop at the intersection across the street from the Hardys. I mean, it was
Nick was like, while this is happening, he was calling me saying, I'm sipping sweet tea.
yeah, I mean, and McCray's just sitting at Terry's having some tea, and fan down. I mean,
It was almost like they were ready to do the like swing in through the windows thing, kick the windows in. So McCray's just like sitting there.
It
Okay, I
was,
guess I'll go.
I mean, they drove his car back. I think he asked to go get his heart medicine and have one more cigarette, and then he went for the long ride to Raleigh to go to jail that day. And what happened after that is also crazy, but I'll let you read that book.
That's great. Great. So, and actually, some of that just reminds me too, before we close or take questions from the audience. I was sort of drawing parallels to some other books about North Carolina, but as y'all were talking, I hadn't made this connection till right now, but the conversation anyway makes me think a lot about Mike Woiko's Boss, which is obviously about a very different place, right? It's about Chicago and Richard Daley and what happened there. But the storytelling actually is to me a nice parallel for how you could tell a story about politics that is very much of a place, but that means something beyond that place.
To me, this isn't a book about politics. I mean, it is, right?
Yeah.
In the underpinning, but really, this is a book about people and a place.
Yes.
Place being Bladen County and the people who live in Bladen County. And that's what the book is about. It's not really about Mark Harris. It's not really about the 9th Congressional District. Election fraud happens to be maybe we'll call it the setting. But I think of the place of Bladen County as actually being a character in this book.
Mhm.
The politics and the election is all incidental to the story we're telling about people who live in Bladen County.
So, questions from the audience? Nope, on the spot.
All right.
Yes, please.
Given the environment in Bladen County and talking about how it's been sort of a long-standing tradition of sort of this vote harvesting and some other things that are going on. And again, of course, I think about Madison County and some of the other parts west. It almost sounds like the adults running these operations didn't necessarily think they were doing anything wrong because there had never been any consequences prior. And it was sort of this idea of, we're kind of pushing up against this gray area, but no one's really ever slapped our hands. So obviously we're not doing anything that bad.
110%. I mean, is it a crime if you've been doing it for 10 or 20 years? Is it a crime if it's been reported before and no one came down and did anything? In your mind, right? I mean, I'm not talking about did McCray actually commit a crime,
Right.
He'll have his day in court. But if you've been doing this, if you know that it's been investigated time and again, it's not like the investigator from the state board didn't know the drive really well from Wake County to Bladen County, right? I mean, and this is just how people voted. This is just what they did. And this is it, you won or lost an election based on how well did your operation perform that year. And that's what it was, for better or for worse. And that's how it happened. And into all of that walked Mark Harris.
Go ahead. And do you think that there will be a recalibration moving forward? Or do you think it's more of a real hard recalibration? Or do you think it's more like a soft reset where everyone's going to be like, okay, now we kind of know where the line is. We're just going to scooch back a little bit.
We did scooch back. the Bladen County Improvement Association certainly screeched back in 2018 when they were alerted that there was an investigation going on. To the scooching back, McCray Dallas isn't working in politics anymore. So you have like these small examples of it, but
I fear that unless some actual meaningful systemic reform is implemented, this is just going to keep happening. And charging and arresting one dude and the people who work for him is not systemic reform.
and if this creates like an interesting hypothetical, but if McCray Dallas is ultimately the only person punished for this, which is possible that could happen, it will only end, and then let's say in 2024, 22, whenever there's a sheriff's race again, the Bladen County Improvement Association is active and does elect a lot of its candidates. You will see somebody from the McCray Dallas side of the equation fill a void there. I mean,
Or challenge it, and what'll happen?
because they will say, well, this only happened because you didn't care about what they were doing. And look what happened. And then, the underlining, like, there's certainly, you can talk about the racism that will underline all those comments. You'll say, like, look what happened, we got a black sheriff again, or something like that. There's going to be a lot of that. But what I always say, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. What will happen is somebody will fill this void. It's not going to be McCray Dallas. He's 7. He's almost 70 years old now. Not in great health. So it's not going to be him. But
Somebody. Yes, ma'am.
So when this happened, I was following it. I saw the candidate break into tears whenever his son testified against him. The question in my mind then was, how long has this been going on? And, in Buncombe County, we have our own systemic, how long has this been going on? And I just kind of feel like this whole thing is machine politics that has been happening here since the Civil War, because I have relatives in Robeson County who were part of the Berry gang, and the blacks and the Indians were pushed into Robeson County. And I feel like what you're talking about here with the black sheriff is part of that early history after the Civil War. And certainly here in Buncombe County, it didn't look to me like Wanda Green thought she was doing anything wrong at all. Like you said, what we've been doing is all like this this is how we do it.
I think that's important. I think that is why it is so important to look at your institutions, right? Institutions. And I mean, exactly, again, I'll reiterate that Mark Harris, what happened, Mark Harris was the candidate, but what McCray Dallas and others did had nothing to do with Mark, really, right? I mean, it's not something Mark Harris sat in his kitchen and said, how are we going to have a ballot operation?
Right.
So I think you hit the nail exactly on that.
yeah, I mean, you certainly, tracing it back to there is really important, because that's why we were 120 pages of the book in that era, because the roots of the reasons that these political action committees, these black political action committees exist, it was necessary to overcome literacy tests, to overcome all these things. How are you ever going to get represented in Durham and change a bus station? Like, a lot of the Durham Political Action Committee formed in part because of this. There was a bus station issue where just like, why do we have to have the bad part of the bus station? Like, why can't we participate in the nice part of the bus station? And so the Durham Political Action Committee forms with C.C. Spalding leading the way. And their efforts, the Durham Political Action Committee was sort of the grandfather of the Bladen County Improvement Association. That's why they're reformed all over the state for absolutely the most important reason at all. It's just to get representation for an for people who just had it ripped away because of the way, because of what happened in the 1890s. And just, you have to talk about that if you're going to talk about why there was a white backlash to that too in places like Bladen County. You have to talk about the efforts that happened. Yeah, it's really important. So you nailed it.
So the nice thing about being in the store is we can actually hear the bell chime on the hour out on the street. So we know it's 7 o'clock. Thank you for your questions. I just want to invite y'all to provide any last thoughts before we say goodnight to the online audience. Proceed to maybe some book sales. And thank you, first of all, thank you all. It's been a completely engrossing conversation, and we appreciate it.
My last thoughts are thank you. That's, I mean, I've lived in North Carolina for 20 years, and to have this is our first book event for the first book that I've ever written.
Definitely.
And this place, and I've worked for Our State Magazine, worked for, I've come to Asheville many times. And this is a dream place to have a first conversation about this. So thank you.
We're delighted to have you.
Yes. I'll just echo what he said. It was great.
Chris, any last words?
No, just thanks. By the book, it really is. It's a great story, and it's an important story, and these are the two perfect people to tell it. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's give everyone